Hi, welcome to Kiwi Hellenist. I'm Peter Gainsford, and we are here with another video about the Homeric Odyssey. Now, today we are on to the Wanderings, which is probably the best known bit of the Odyssey. A lot of the most famous stories about Odysseus come from this part of the Odyssey. This is books 9 to 12 of the Odyssey, so it's a whole sixth of the epic. I am going to talk about a couple of the more famous episodes in the Wanderings, particularly the Cyclops episode and the conversations with the dead ghosts in Book 11. But first, a more general comment. The Wanderings are told as a flashback. This is probably the most famous instance of storytelling in medias res, as the Roman poet Horace famously puts it, taking the reader into the middle of the story. And then you have some of the most famous parts of the story end up being told as a flashback. And that's how we get the Wanderings. Now, that is, like I said, it's a really famous example of that trope. But there is something more going on here. There is a particular effect that the poet, that the narrator gets from doing this, from setting the Wanderings in a flashback, and that is to create a sense of distance. There's a kind of an extra layer of storytelling between us, the audience, and the events, like the Cyclops, the Lystragonians, the Lotus Eaters, and so on. So we've got some of the most famous material, as I said, Lotus Eaters, Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, but there's this extra layer of separation between us and that material. This is probably a deliberate effect. And this is something that the Odyssey poet does actually considerably more than the Iliad does, to create this sense of distance when you're dealing with fantastical material. Now, here, essentially what I'm saying is that there is perhaps arguably a certain truth to. There's a famous article by the late scholar Jasper Griffin, arguing that Homer consciously avoids fantastical elements. Now, I don't fully agree with that. We've got plenty of fantastical elements in the Iliad in particular, and of course in the Wanderings, in the Odyssey. But in the case of the Odyssey, there is this extra separation that the poet gets by adding this layer of storytelling between us and the material. And it's not just in the Wanderings, it happens elsewhere in the Odyssey as well. When Menelaus is telling his story to Telemachus in Book 4, and we have the story of Proteus, Menelaus and his men disguising themselves as seals, and this encounter with this god who changes form and predicts the future. Then in the Wanderings, we've got monsters, cannibals, sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, cattle of the sun. All of this is wild, fantastical material. And if you compare that with the main narrative, you can see that the main narrative, although there are some relatively implausible elements to it, like, for example, the weaving of Penelope's weaving of the shroud for Laertes, taking 3 years before the suitors actually notice what's going on. Yeah, okay, there's some implausible material there, but it's not really fantastical in the same way that these monsters and fairy tale stuff. Compare that with the Iliad, where you have talking horses, and that's in the main narrative. There's no effort to separate that from the events in the main narrative. It's actually part of the main narrative, or the bit where a river chases Achilles across the battlefield. I find it really hard to imagine the Odyssey poet even trying something like that. So we do have this layer of separation with the more fantastical elements. Now, that said, let's move on to some of the most famous episodes. The most famous, and one of the first ones that we get in the Wanderings in Book 9, is the story of the Cyclops, Polyphemus. And there's a lot going on there. I've touched on some of it in the hospitality video, because one of the things that the Cyclops does is to put on a big show of being we have the standard elements of a hospitality scene built into the story, but the Cyclops puts on a big show of being the worst possible host. There's also a big show of the Cyclopes being the worst possible people you could encounter on your travels as well. They are cast as barbaric. They don't have technology. They don't have laws. They don't worship the gods. They don't have farming. They don't have agriculture. They don't even have cooking. They don't cook their food. So they're cast as being as backward as possible. Now, there have been arguments that this is an attempt to represent a real historical hunter-gatherer society. That's not really plausible, and the main reason why I say that is because everything we're told about the Cyclopes is what they don't have, things that they don't do. It's all negative. This is basically false archaism at its most blatant. Everything we're told about the Cyclopes is something that's missing from their society and from their culture. So it's not really an attempt to depict anything positive. It's an attempt to look at what Greeks do and how they live, and just subtract all of the things that you think of as making them civilized. And so the Cyclopes are what you get when you remove all of the civilized features from a civilized culture. So backward is exactly the right way of looking at them. They're cast as being as backward as possible. The story of the Cyclops itself combines a bunch of folktale elements. There's two major folktales built into it. First, the story of the hero who gets who gets trapped, I should say, in a monster's cave, and he has to escape by one means or another. A good parallel for that would be the story of Sinbad the Sailor in the 1001 Nights. But also we've got the nobody storyline. The hero is interviewed by a monster, and he says, "Oh, my name is Nobody," and this leads to this leads to some misunderstanding on the monster's part, which is part of the hero's victory over the monster. And a good parallel for that. The only one that comes to mind is the story of Fafnir in Norse mythology, where it is Siegfried, isn't it, or Sigurd, I should say, who calls himself Merman, or something. I may have the details wrong. We can check that. So that is the basic folkloric underpinning of the Cyclops story, and it's combined with the hospitality storyline, the Cyclops being cast as a terrible, terrible host. But there's also, very famously, an incident of wordplay. Now, don't think of this as a pun. Whenever we encounter wordplay in modern Western culture, we think of it in terms of puns, and it's a really bad habit. It's not about it's not a joke. The most famous part of this wordplay is the nobody storyline. So Odysseus is interviewed by the Cyclops, and he says, "My name is Nobody." And the Cyclops says, "Well, haha, Nobody, my gift to you will be that I'll eat you last. Hooray. Yay, thanks." And so when Odysseus does trick the Cyclops, he gets him drunk because he's such a barbarian, he doesn't know how to deal with wine, so he gets drunk, he falls asleep. Odysseus and his men poke out his eye with a glowing a glowing wooden stake, which is itself really implausible. Heating wood to the point where it's glowing does not make it sharper. This is a relic of an older form of the folktale where a metal spit was used, but since the Cyclopes don't cook their food, you couldn't have a metal spit, so we have a wooden stake instead. But the glowing has stayed in the story. Anyway, so once the Cyclops has his eye poked out, he shrieks horribly, of course. Other Cyclopes come running, and they ask what's wrong. And famously, we have the Cyclops say, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is hurting me," and words to that effect. In fact, let me read that bit out to you. Now, I'm going to show on screen a copy of the text from Dindorf's edition of the Odyssey. That's not the edition I'm going to be reading from. This is the standard text of the Odyssey that I'm using by Fantiel, Helmut Fantiel. There is a more recent edition in the Teubner series by Martin West, of course. How to compare them? let's say that while I will admit that West's scholarship is superior, I think Fantil's text is superior. And let's just leave it at that. Let's not talk about the text and additions too much. Okay, so the moment when the Cyclopes come running and the Cyclops says, "No man is killing me."
Today I'm using the prose translation by Martin Hammond, and for the Greek, well, in the first two videos I used a reconstructed historical pronunciation and modern Greek pronunciation. Today I figured, why not use Koine? That is to say, the common dialect of Greek spoken throughout the Mediterranean in the Hellenistic period and Roman period. Or as we should call it, Kuni, because that's how it's pronounced in Koine. Since wordplay is important here, I'll do it line by line. He stamenu diron to perispeos hoti hekidu. They gathered outside the cave and asked him what the trouble was. Tip de toson polyphemari menos ho deboesas. Polyphemus, why this shouting in such distress? Nukta di ambrosin caeupnus am matithista. In the middle of the immortal night, robbing us of our sleep. Imitis sev mila broton aekontos elavni? Is any man stealing your flocks and driving them off? Imitis savton ktini dolo iebifi? Is any man trying to kill you through cunning or superior strength? Tous dav dextantru prosefi kratoros polyphemos. Then mighty Polyphemus answered them from inside the cave. O philu utis mectini dolo udebifi. No, my friends, no superior strength, no man is trying to kill me through his cunning. Hu dapami bomenu epeap teroen tagorefon. They spoke winged words in reply. Eman dimitis sebiazete uon eonta. Well, if you are alone and no man is overpowering you. Nou son gupos esti dios megalu aleaste. You must have a sickness sent by great Zeus, and that cannot be helped. Alas sugefkeo patri Poseidaoni anakti. No, you should pray to your father, Lord Poseidon. Hos ar ephan apiontes emondegelas sephilon kir. So they spoke as they went away, and the heart within me laughed to see. Hos onomex apatis enemon kermitis anumon. How my splendid know-how with the name had fooled them.
Okay, so there you have it. Now, you get a strong sense of what's going on, even in a translation. Odysseus has said that his name is Nobody, and the Cyclops says, "Nobody is killing me," and of course that becomes the butt of a joke. And it's pretty close to how wordplay works in English language jokes as well. But, however, I want to go a little bit further into the ancient Greek and show you how there are actually 4 words being played on here. 4 words that are being mingled and blended, and the full sense of the wordplay doesn't come across unless you can grasp all 4 of those. The words are, and I'll use a reconstructed pronunciation here, so listen carefully for the intonation: ootis, ootis, metis, and metis, and all 4 of them mean different things. So in order, ootis is the name that Odysseus gives to, he says that my name is Ootis. Ootis is the word that means nobody. So very similar, but not exactly the same. Ootis is the name, Ootis is the word for nobody. But alongside those we have 2 other words. Metis, which means nobody, but in some specific constructions. And metis, which means a cunning plan. So the whole point is that we've got all 4 of these being played on in one short passage. So the Cyclops, in taking them in order, the Cyclops says, "Ootis is killing me." The other Cyclopes hear this and say, "Ah, well, okay, Ootis is killing you. Fine, nobody is killing you, nobody is hurting you. Nothing's wrong then." Then they carry on and they say, "If nobody Metis is killing you, then we'll just toddle off home." And then in the aftermath of this exchange, Odysseus laughs because of the success of his metis, his cunning plan. So there's a rapid succession of plays on similar words here. The key is that utis is the normal word for nobody. Let me let me resort to a little bit of grammatical geekery here. Utis is the word that you use in a normal statement when you're using the indicative mood. Metis is the form that you use when you are either using a mood other than the indicative or in the protasis of a conditional, and that's the latter that we've got here. The Cyclopes say, if nobody is killing you, then we'll scarper, and so that's the metis that we're getting in this episode here. So 4 words being played on here. Now, this is not an isolated thing. And don't go thinking of it as a joke. There was a book that I read a long, long time ago. I can't remember what it was. I used to think it was Alexander Pope's introduction to his translation of the Odyssey, but I recently went back and looked at it and I can't find it there. I don't know where I found this. If it's not Alexander Pope, I don't know who it is, but he compares the Iliad and the Odyssey, whoever this writer is, and says that the Iliad is clearly incomparably superior because the Iliad poet would never stoop to using a pun. Now, whether that was Pope or not, I don't know. Maybe someone can say in the comments if you happen to know who it is that I'm thinking of. Don't think of it as a pun. It's more akin to word magic than to a humorous joke. It happens to work pretty well in English as a joke. But there is a lot of wordplay in the Odyssey, and it's not just in the Odyssey, it's in the Iliad as well. There's a lot of wordplay on the name of Odysseus, on this nobody thing, and there's some wordplay that we'll be talking about in a later video as well. When Odysseus reveals himself to his son, there's some wordplay going on there, which I'll talk about in the next video, which will be on Odysseus himself. So I'll talk more about this wordplay next time. In the meantime, if you want to read up on it before then, I'm putting an article on screen now. I think it's a Bruce Loudon, Tapper 2000 and something, or 1996. I forget the details. I'll put the details on screen. Does have an article on wordplay in Homer, but there's a lot of wordplay in early Greek literature. It's not just in this nobody scene. It's not just in the Odyssey. There's some in the Iliad. Aeschylus has loads of wordplay. Some lyric poets have wordplay. So there's a lot going on in this scene. Of course, famously after this comes the bit where Odysseus escapes. He and his men hide underneath the Cyclops' sheep, and so get out that way. Then they drive the sheep off, steal them, sail away. And as they're sailing away, Odysseus boasts of his victory, and that gets him into trouble. The take that modern readers have on Odysseus in this episode is usually not very positive, but like I said, the next episode of this series will be on Odysseus himself, so I'll talk more about that then. In the meantime, let's move on to the ensuing episodes in the Wanderings. We have Odysseus's visit to the Isle of the Winds. We have Odysseus visiting the island of Circe or Circe. We have the Dead Book, as it's called, the Nekyia. And of course there's all the episodes in Book 12 as well. I do want to just talk a little bit about the Dead Book. And some of the overall plan of the Dead Book, because it's perhaps the most challenging bit of the Wanderings in some respects. Odysseus is commanded by Circe to go to a place far off to the west, beyond the ocean, beyond the river ocean, because Greeks of the time thought of the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, as a river that encircled the Eurasian African continent. So he goes to the land beyond this river, and he makes sacrifices and speaks with ghosts of the dead. And this is the Dead Book, the Nekyia. There is there are a lot of conversations that he has with the various ghosts, so it can be a little hard to find much structure or pattern or progression in this episode. But there is a definite sense of progression. In the first place, the Nekyia is divided into two main chunks. Conversations with essentially non-warriors, non-heroes. Then we have a short interval, an intermission, and then we have a bunch of conversations with heroes, mostly heroes from the Trojan War. Agamemnon, Achilles, Ajax, Aias. The first part of this is actually, well, rather clearly structured. He starts off by meeting one of his own men, Elpenor, who died just a few lines earlier. He's this poor sap who fell off Circe's roof and broke his neck because he was late leaving Circe's house. Then he sees the ghost of his mother. Odysseus sees the ghost of his mother, Anticleia, and then he has this conversation with the dead prophet, Tiresias. And after this, he revisits his mother, and then there's a long series of heroines from the past. With the first three of these, there is a definite sense of stepping backwards in time. He sees the most recently dead one first, Elpenor. That's why Elpenor's there, because he's the one who's just died, just in the last few minutes. Then we move slightly further backwards in time to Odysseus' mother, and then Tiresias, who is a generation earlier. And we have Odysseus' mother coming in between because, of course, of this time progression. But Odysseus does have a sense of priorities, so he puts off having this conversation with his mother until a bit later. But there is a definite structure there. These three big conversations serve as a kind of initial set piece, and then we have another set piece, which is the catalogue of heroines, and they're much shorter accounts of the various heroines that he sees. Then, as I said, we have this intermission. Odysseus pauses in his storytelling, and there's a conversation with the Phaeacians at the court where Odysseus is telling his story. And he he gets offered more gifts, yay! And then he resumes his story by talking about the warrior heroes the major heroes that he encounters in this conversation with the dead. We don't have a definite sequence there. The Agamemnon is the first one that he talks to, but he is the one who died most recently. But after that, we get Aias and Achilles, but then they're not in the correct order. The conversation with Achilles is probably the most famous one of these. It is the occasion for one of the most famous snippets of text in the Odyssey, which I will read to you now.
So I spoke, and he answered me straight away, "Do not talk to me lightly of death, glorious Odysseus. I had rather be above earth and a labourer for another, for a man without land of his own and little to live on, than be king over all the lifeless dead." And in Greek, Hos ephamin, hodem aftik ami bomenos proseipe, mi di mu thanaton geparavta fedi modusev, bulumin keparuros eon, thitefemen allo, andri parakliro, hon mi biotos polusii, I passi nekyia kataphthimenis in anassi.
Okay, so this snippet is sometimes, all too often, taken as a kind of blanket statement of the standard ancient Greek view of death, and being dead is miserable. I'd rather be dead. I'd rather be living and a serf than rule over all of the dead. These are the words of someone who is clearly upset, but it would be a mistake as taking this as the final word on the subject, because this is not the end of the scene. I've written an article on this that came out in 2008, which goes into this in much more detail. I've got a blog post more recently as well. It's not the end of the scene. This is, as I said, these are the words of someone who is upset and who is saying, don't try and Odysseus, don't try and persuade me that I'm somehow in a good situation. But the scene does continue. Immediately after these words, Achilles goes on, tell me news about my family. Have you heard any word of my father or my son? And this is exactly what Odysseus goes on to give him. He tells him news of his father and his... he can't give news of his father because he doesn't know anything, probably just as well. But he does have a lot to say about Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. And Neoptolemus, it turns out, is one of the greatest of the heroes. There's a lot being left unsaid here. Neoptolemus, of course, is a kind of notorious as a bloodthirsty monster, but that isn't what Odysseus says. What Odysseus tells Achilles is that he's a great hero, he's really good at making plans and talking, he's brave, and he's won lots of riches. He's a successful story. And the story of your family passing on, your heritage passing on to the next generation. That's a successful story. And we're told after this, Achilles strode off across the asphodel field in joy because I had told him of his famous son. So that is really the payoff for this scene. It's not... The opening words, Achilles' words about "I'd rather be a live serf than king of the dead," these are the words of someone who is thinking of his own situation, someone who is upset about his own condition. But that's not the big picture. The big picture is the one that comes after those words. And it's probably fair to say that the rest of the scene is never going to be as hard-hitting as those opening words, so I don't really expect to... people to stop quoting those words. But it is a scene that's more about the living than about the dead. The whole scene is much more, as Vernon argued in his famous in a famous essay that he wrote about this scene, it's about the values of the living, not about the values of the dead. Even Vernon didn't bother to read beyond Achilles' words, but he had the right idea. So that is the other famous scene. Again, after these conversations with Achilles, Aias and Agamemnon, we have another catalogue of heroes from the past as well, and Heracles pops up. So that is the Book of the Dead. What else do we have to say about the Wanderings? One other thing that should be said is that the Wanderings, people are always trying to work out where Odysseus went in his wanderings. Odysseus hunters. It's a never-ending preoccupation. This went on in antiquity as well, and the geographer Eratosthenes, a very famous geographer and scientist, famously said that you'll find the route of Odysseus' wanderings when you find the cobbler who sewed up the bag of the winds. He was a skeptic. For the record, I'm a skeptic too. I don't think... it's certainly not worth trying to paint Odysseus' wanderings as though they're real. But there are real traditions about the wanderings. There are real accounts from antiquity of where people thought Odysseus had travelled. And these are important, not because they're clues as to Odysseus' route, but because they are telling us about how people in various parts of the world saw themselves and their relationship to this legend of someone journeying, this legendary, this arch traveller, this arch colonist. He's not actually colonizing, but he is exploring the Western Mediterranean and all over the place in a way that serves as a paradigm for colonists of the time. There are many places that you can find out about this. My recommendation is to take a look at a website that the Canadian scholar Jonathan Burgess has set up. He's got a terrific website. I haven't looked at it for years. I've just looked at it recently, and it's changed quite a lot, but it's always been excellent. It's even more excellent now. Good job, Jonathan. So that is definitely the place to look if you want to find out who has plotted Odysseus' wanderings where. For the record, the most standard identifications of Odysseus' route in antiquity have him visiting the Lotus Eaters. Actually, that one's not so certain. But we do have the Cyclops in Sicily. Aeolus and the Isle of the Winds is in the Isola Aeoliae in just north of Sicily. Then he works his way up the west coast of Italy, so stopping off at Cumae and Lake Avernus for his conversation with the ghosts. That idea casts the conversation with the ghosts as a psychagogia, a soul summoning, because this is something that did happen at the shores of lakes, some lakes in antiquity, where you could go and summon up the ghosts of the dead and have conversations with them. So Lake Avernus, near Naples, is the scene, is the most traditional scene for that in ancient traditions. After that, we have, the visit with the dead. Well, of course, that's tied in with... that is Avernus, isn't it? Of course. Circe, I missed out Circe. She is at Monte Circeo, which is a bit north of there, in the middle of Latium, a bit south of Rome. The Romans founded a colony named after Circe there, Circe. We have the Sirens at the Cyrenuse rocks just south of Sorrento, and we have Scylla and Charybdis at the Strait of Messina between Sicily and the toe of Italy. So those would be the most standard ones in antiquity. But of course, Odysseus hunters and modern Odysseus hunters are never going to stop trying to find alternate locations for some of these. Anywho, that is The Wanderings from books 9 to 12. I apologise that I cannot possibly talk about every episode in equal detail. Next time I'm going to be talking about Odysseus and his character, the way his character is... characters don't develop in the Odyssey in the same way that they do in modern books, but that's the kind of thing I'm going to be talking about. I look forward to seeing you then, and I hope you're keeping sane in lockdown. We're down to alert level 3 here in New Zealand. Life hasn't changed much, although people are apparently visiting fast food joints a lot more. Crazy. Anyway, stay safe. See you next time. Bye for now.